The tension in the cabin was palpable as a loud slap echoed through the aircraft. The sudden sound of flesh against flesh froze 230 passengers in their seats. The eyes of everyone on the flight were fixed on 17-year-old Jake Thompson, whose head snapped sideways in shock, his cheek glowing red as a powerful slap left him stunned. His eyes widened in disbelief and humiliation. Standing over him was a man in his mid-50s, John Richards, his face flushed with anger. "I told you to stay in your place, boy," John sneered, pointing a finger at Jake's face. The words lingered in the air, suffocating, heavy with the weight of years of deep-seated racism. Passengers, most with smartphones already in hand, could feel the situation teetering on the edge of something far worse. The flight attendants rushing down the aisle were still too far away to intervene. For a few heartbeats there was no movement, no sound, just the deafening silence of a cabin suspended in collective shock at 38,000 feet. Then, from the back of the plane, a figure stood. He was a man in his late 60s, average height, with salt and pepper hair and a weathered face that spoke of a life lived. He moved with a quiet authority, something about his demeanor demanding attention despite his unremarkable appearance. He wasn't the type of man you would notice at first glance, but in that moment he commanded the space around him. The flight attendant, trying to maintain control, called out, "Sir, please take your seat. We need everyone to remain seated for takeoff." "I can't do that," the man's voice rang out clear and steady. It wasn't loud, but it carried a tone of unshakable resolve. "Not this time." His words were like a challenge to the atmosphere that had gripped the cabin. What happened next would change everything for everyone on that flight, altering lives, revealing deep truths, and testing the limits of what people are willing to do when confronted with injustice. To understand why this retired Vietnam War veteran, a man named Alan Carson, would risk everything for a young man he didn't even know, we need to go back 6 hours earlier, to a small gate in New York's LaGuardia Airport. Jake Thompson, a 17-year-old high school student, hated flying. Unlike many his age, he was deeply uneasy at the thought of being confined in a metal tube for hours, floating in the sky. He had flown twice before, but both flights were short and relatively uneventful. This flight to California, however, felt different. It was a long-haul flight, almost 6 hours, to Los Angeles, and the anxiety that had always lurked just beneath the surface began to grow. But Jake would never admit it, not to anyone, especially not to his father. "Got your boarding pass?" His father, Robert Thompson, asked for the third time in 15 minutes, his concern coming through in his meticulousness. "Yes, Dad, it's in my wallet, just like last time," Jake said, trying to keep the irritation out of his voice. He loved his father, but the constant checking, the constant double-checking, was something he was used to by now. Robert was a successful businessman, always thinking ahead, always planning. It made him a great professional, but sometimes a bit exhausting as a parent. "Are your presentations backed up? On your laptop, in the cloud, and emailed to me and your teacher?" his dad continued, seemingly unable to let go of the details. "Dad, I've got it. I'm not going to forget. This is a big deal, I know." Robert nodded, his face softening as he placed his hands on Jake's shoulders. "I'm proud of you, Jake, not just for the competition, but for how you've handled all of this," he said, a rare moment of tenderness from the man who was often seen as strict and practical. "It's been tough with your mom away, but you've done well." Jake smiled faintly at his father's words. His mother had been in Paris for over a year now, leaving a wound in their family that hadn't quite healed. It was as if every day Jake had to carry that weight alone, handling school, keeping up with his grades, and making sure everything at home ran smoothly. All the while, his friends were out doing what teenagers did, having fun, playing games, hanging out at the mall. Jake had matured faster than most of them, a necessity given the circumstances, but his father's approval meant everything. As Jake prepared to board, his mind wandered to the flight ahead, and his preoccupation with his father's concerns distracted him just long enough for him to almost bump into a man in his early 50s. The man wore a well-tailored suit, the kind that screamed corporate executive, and he turned sharply. a flash of irritation crossing his face before it settled into a thin, dismissive smile. "Watch where you're going, kid," the man said coldly, a hint of derision in his voice. "First time flying?" Jake straightened up, his instinct kicking in to defend himself, to assert that he wasn't just some naive teen. "No, sir, just distracted," he said, his voice calm, controlled. His Harvard interview voice, as his father had called it. He wasn't going to be caught off guard. The man's eyebrows lifted in mild surprise, but he nodded curtly before turning away. Jake could feel the subtle shift in the air, the moment when expectations were recalibrated. He had done something most people didn't expect. A tall black teenager speaking like someone from a world they didn't understand. He glanced around, trying to shake off the feeling of discomfort, and noticed an older woman, probably in her 70s, with a warm smile. She caught his eye and, with a gentle southern lilt, asked, "Are you traveling alone?" "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied, offering a brief explanation of his purpose, his trip to Los Angeles for the National Science Decathlon. The woman's smile widened, and to his surprise she seemed genuinely interested. "My grandson competed last year, though he didn't make the finals," she said. "But now he's studying at UCLA. That competition is impressive." Jake felt a small surge of optimism. If his seatmates were anything like this woman, maybe this flight wouldn't be so bad after all. But as he boarded and took his seat, it was clear that not everyone was as welcoming. The man in the tailored suit, now sitting across the aisle, returned to his disdainful silence, and Jake knew the journey ahead wouldn't be an easy one. But just when things seemed their darkest, an unexpected ally would step in, changing the course of the flight and their lives forever. 6 hours earlier, at LaGuardia Airport in New York, Jake Thompson stood in line at gate C-42, trying to ignore the rising knot of anxiety in his stomach. He hated flying. It wasn't just the cramped space of the airplane or the turbulence that made him uneasy. It was the feeling of being out of control, like a tiny speck in a giant metal tube, miles above the ground. He'd only flown a couple of times before, once to visit his grandmother, and then again to see her funeral. Both of those flights had been short. This one, though, to Los Angeles for the National Science Decathlon, was different. This was a long flight, and with it came the weight of his father's high expectations. Jake tried to push the thought of his father's anxious questions to the back of his mind. Robert Thompson, a well-known businessman in the city, was nothing if not thorough. And today, like every time before a trip, Robert asked his son the same questions, over and over. "Got your boarding pass?" Robert asked, once again his voice strained with concern. "Jake, you have your pass, right?" "Yes, Dad," Jake muttered, pulling out the boarding pass from his wallet. He tried not to sound impatient, but it was hard. The constant repetition was one of the ways his father showed he cared, but at times it felt like a never-ending checklist. "And everything's backed up, right? Your presentation files are on your laptop, in the cloud, and emailed to both me and your professor," Robert added, his eyes scanning the airport around them, as if waiting for something to go wrong. "Dad, I've got it," Jake said with a forced calm. "I've been to these competitions before. I know the drill." Robert's gaze softened, and for a moment Jake saw the pride in his father's eyes. Despite the overprotectiveness, Robert had always been supportive, almost to a fault. "I'm proud of you, Jake," he said quietly, as though the words were rare, slipping from his lips in a moment of tenderness. "Not just for the competition, but for how you've handled all of this. All the changes. Your mom's been gone for so long, and you've stepped up. It hasn't been easy, but you've been solid." Jake smiled faintly. His mom had been away in Paris for nearly a year, leaving behind a wound in their family that still hadn't quite healed. It was almost as if every day Jake had to put on a brave face and pretend everything was fine, even though the silence of her absence filled the house. Still, he'd kept his grades up, helped his father with the housework, and never once complained. But that didn't make it easier. "Thanks, Dad," Jake said, forcing a more genuine smile. He wasn't going to argue about his father's way of showing affection. It was awkward, sure, but at least he cared. "Go ahead and get in line," Robert said, his voice suddenly practical again. "I'll be here waiting." Jake nodded and squeezed his father's shoulder briefly before heading toward the boarding gate. He had always felt torn between irritation and gratitude when it came to his father. Robert's overprotectiveness was sometimes a burden, but deep down, Jake knew it came from a place of love. As he joined the boarding line, Jake tried to shake off the anxiety that had begun to settle in his chest. The competition was important, but it wasn't just the event that weighed on him. It was the constant pressure, the unspoken expectation that he would always be better than others. As the son of Robert Thompson, Jake often felt like he was being measured by different standards that others didn't have to meet. His achievements, no matter how impressive, always felt like they were under a microscope. Lost in his thoughts, Jake nearly bumped into a man in a sharp gray suit. The man, looking at Jake with an annoyed scowl, took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "Watch where you're going, kid," he muttered, his tone laced with condescension. "First time flying?" Jake froze for a moment, his instinct to defend himself flaring up, but instead he took a deep breath and stood a little straighter. He knew that responding in anger would only make things worse. "No, sir," Jake replied, keeping his voice calm and controlled, just the way his father had taught him. "Just distracted for a second, my apologies." The man looked at him for a moment, clearly surprised that Jake had answered him with such poise. He let out a small huff, almost as if reconsidering his initial judgment, but didn't say anything else. He turned away, dismissing Jake as if he were an insignificant blip in the crowd. Jake's chest tightened, the familiar sting of judgment creeping in. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him based on the color of his skin, the way he looked, or the way he spoke. But it still hurt every time. "Hey, are you traveling alone?" A warm voice broke through his thoughts. Jake turned to see an older woman with kind eyes and silver hair smiling up at him. She looked about 70, maybe older, and there was something about her that felt genuinely welcoming. "Yes, ma'am," Jake replied, his voice softer now. He gave her a brief explanation about the National Science Decathlon, figuring it would be easier to let her know he wasn't just another random teenager on a flight. The woman's smile widened. "My grandson competed in that last year," she said. "He didn't make the finals, but now he's studying at UCLA." Jake felt a spark of hope at hearing that. Maybe this flight wouldn't be so bad after all. As the woman continued talking, Jake let his guard down just a little. This woman was the first person he'd met on the trip who didn't have a preconceived notion of who he was based on his appearance. She saw him for who he was, not who she assumed he was. And that felt good. But as soon as he turned to board, he saw him again. The man in the gray suit sitting down in the first-class section, his expensive tablet resting on the table in front of him. Jake's optimism began to drain away again. When Jake reached his seat in economy, he found himself wedged between the man in the gray suit and a young woman around his age with dark hair falling over her face. The man immediately made a disapproving face when Jake tried to squeeze past him. Jake could feel the tension in the air. Another judgment, another assumption. As the flight took off, Jake couldn't help but think about the strange, uncomfortable dance he'd been performing all his life, fitting into a world that often saw him as an outsider, even when he didn't want to be. He sighed and settled into his seat. And so, with a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation for the competition ahead, Jake Thompson began his journey. Little did he know that the most important moments of the flight had yet to come. The flight continued its steady climb, the sounds of the engine hum becoming a lullaby that only a few passengers seemed to mind. Jake Thompson sat in his cramped seat, wedged between the man in the gray suit and Sophie, the girl, on the other side of the aisle. His heart was still racing, but he forced himself to relax. At least the woman in the boarding line, Mrs. Chen, had given him a bit of hope. Maybe this trip wouldn't be as bad as he had feared, if only he didn't have to deal with the constant pressure of people like the man next to him. The tension between Jake and the man in the gray suit was palpable. Jake could feel it in every nerve, every inch of his body, as if the space between them was charged with an unspoken hostility. He could feel the man's gaze on him, a thinly veiled judgment that had been there since they first crossed paths. Jake knew that feeling well. He had felt it countless times in the past. People saw him, a tall, black teenager, and immediately assumed things about him, things that were never true. Sophie, on the other hand, was making an effort to break the ice. She was a little quirky, a little more comfortable than Jake, and she had an easy smile. She had already tried a couple of attempts at conversation, though Jake could tell she was being careful. Sophie was aware of the tension too. The man next to them, the gray suit guy, kept giving them glares whenever they spoke or exchanged a few words. Sophie was undeterred, though. She smiled at Jake, her amber eyes bright with mischief, and whispered, "We really should make these conversations louder. Just for fun. Give them something to complain about." Jake couldn't help but laugh, the first genuine laugh he'd had since boarding the plane. "Yeah, that'd be a good way to drive him crazy," he muttered, a spark of amusement flickering in his chest. But the man, John Richards, wasn't having it. As Sophie giggled, he cleared his throat loudly, as if to make it clear that their noise was unacceptable. "Some of us are trying to work," he said curtly, not even bothering to look at them. His voice was low but sharp, meant to sting. Sophie rolled her eyes dramatically, then mimed zipping her lips. "I think he's trying to study for his Nobel Prize," she whispered, trying to suppress a laugh. Jake smirked. Yeah, if only his study included a course on basic manners. The moment was fleeting, but it broke the ice. For the first time since boarding, Jake felt like he wasn't alone in this. Sophie wasn't just some random seatmate. She was someone who saw the discomfort he was experiencing. She wasn't trying to ignore it. She was trying to make it better, even if it was just for a few minutes of shared humor. Sophie then turned to her book, but Jake could see the subtle glances she threw at the man beside them, as if waiting for him to make his next move. Meanwhile, Jake, not wanting to engage any further with the man, pulled out his earbuds and put on some music. He was determined not to let the negativity invade his space. But that didn't last long. The man next to him, Richards, had been sitting in silence for the past few minutes, but Jake could feel the shift in the air. Something was coming. He could sense it. Richards was already too far gone in his own head, and Jake was the perfect target. Jake felt his muscles tense up in anticipation. Just as he began to settle into the rhythm of his playlist, the man leaned over and nudged Jake with his elbow, pressing against the shared armrest. Jake had seen this move before. It was subtle, but it was a deliberate grab for more space, a quiet claim of ownership over what should be shared. Jake felt the urge to pull back, but something inside him refused. He wasn't going to let Richards push him around. It wasn't just about the armrest. It was about every moment he had been made to feel smaller than he was. For once, he wasn't going to retreat into the shadows of his seat. With a deep breath, Jake shifted his arm back onto the armrest, claiming his own space. It wasn't a huge move, but it felt like one. It was a tiny victory, but it meant everything to him. Richards stiffened, his jaw tightening, but he didn't say anything. That small act, that tiny reclaiming of space, left Jake with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He wasn't going to shrink. Not anymore. Sophie, noticing the subtle tension in the air, gave Jake a look of silent solidarity. She didn't say anything, but her eyes told him everything. She was with him no matter what, and for the first time on this flight, Jake didn't feel so alone. As the flight went on, the unease between Jake and Richards continued to simmer beneath the surface. Jake found himself distracted by the escalating hostility, but he tried to focus on the competition ahead. The National Science Decathlon was the reason he was on this flight in the first place. He had worked for months preparing his presentation, the hours spent researching gravitational waves from binary black hole mergers. It was a subject that fascinated him, something he had dedicated himself to wholeheartedly. But every time he tried to settle back into his thoughts, Richards would stir, giving him a cold glance or making a passive-aggressive comment. It was exhausting. Jake kept reminding himself that he wasn't there to get dragged into any of this. He was there for something bigger than this flight, bigger than Richards and his judgment. But it was hard to ignore. When the seatbelt sign pinged off and the plane finally reached cruising altitude, Jake took it as his moment to escape. "Excuse me," he muttered to Richards, who reluctantly moved aside to let him pass. As Jake made his way to the bathroom, he could feel Sophie's eyes following him, and as he passed, she slipped something into his hand, a folded piece of paper. When he unfolded it, he smiled despite the tension gnawing at him. It read, "If he says anything weird to you when I'm not there, just let me know. My mom's a lawyer, she'll eat him alive." Jake chuckled quietly. He felt the weight of her words, the sense that someone was watching his back. For the first time since the flight had begun, he felt like he wasn't just a passive observer of his own life. He had someone with him. As he made his way back to his seat, he found Sophie looking at him with a small, encouraging smile, and for a brief moment Jake allowed himself to breathe. He wasn't in this alone anymore. The cabin felt even smaller now. As the flight cruised along, the tension between Jake and John Richards seemed to fill every inch of the space. Jake could feel the hostility simmering beneath the surface. Richards wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. His every glance was a subtle attack, and his posture was stiff, as if he were daring Jake to make the wrong move. Sophie, sitting on the other side of Jake, had noticed it too. She leaned in closer, giving Jake a conspiratorial wink before returning to her book. But even she couldn't ignore the growing unease. Jake's focus wavered between the escalating discomfort of being in such close quarters with someone who clearly didn't want him there, and the scientific presentation he had been preparing for months. The National Science Decathlon in Los Angeles was a big deal for him. It wasn't just a competition, it was his chance to prove himself, to show the world that he was more than the assumptions people made about him. Gravitational waves from binary black hole mergers. His research was at the cutting edge, and he knew he had something important to share. But the words of John Richards echoed in his mind, tainting the excitement of the competition. The man's cold stares, the subtle jabs, the uncomfortable silence between them. It was all starting to chip away at Jake's resolve. He had grown used to this. People judged him for his height, for the way he dressed, for the color of his skin, but it never made it easier to endure. Sophie seemed to sense it too. Every time she tried to make light of the situation, to bring a smile to Jake's face, Richards would cut in, his voice thick with condescension. "Some of us are trying to work," he'd say, as if their quiet conversations were somehow disrupting his self-important tasks. But Jake wasn't going to let that get to him. Not this time. "Sorry," Jake muttered, trying to squeeze past Richards to get to the bathroom. Richards shifted in his seat, an exaggerated groan of annoyance escaping his lips as he stood, making it clear that Jake was somehow inconveniencing him. The whole interaction was loaded, dripping with unspoken animosity, but Jake kept his cool. It wasn't worth responding. He wasn't going to let Richards drag him into another fight. As Jake made his way down the narrow aisle, he felt Sophie's eyes on him, following him with that same silent support. It was comforting knowing someone had his back, even in such an uncomfortable situation. He wasn't alone. She had noticed the tension, had seen the way Richards had been treating him, and she was there to make sure he knew he didn't have to deal with it by himself. Inside the bathroom, Jake stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the swirl of emotions that had been building ever since the flight began. His cheeks still stung from the tension, from the silent slap of judgment that Richards had given him, but there was more at stake here than just this flight. He had a goal, a purpose. He wasn't going to let this man or this moment define him. The decathlon was his shot, and he wasn't going to waste it. When he returned to his seat, he found Sophie looking at him with a small smile, a silent acknowledgement that they were in this together. She handed him a small folded note. "If he says anything weird to you again," the note read, "let me know. My mom's a lawyer, and she'll eat him alive." Jake grinned, feeling a warmth spread through him despite everything. Sophie wasn't just some random passenger. She was his ally, someone who didn't just notice the racism he faced, but actively fought against it with her own brand of humor and defiance. She was making this flight bearable. even if the man next to them was doing everything he could to make it uncomfortable. As they settled back into their seats, Richards was still busy on his tablet, pretending not to notice the growing tension between them. But Jake could feel it, the subtle way Richards' eyes would flicker toward him, a barely concealed sneer on his face. The man wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. Sophie, always quick to keep the conversation going, leaned toward Jake, her voice low but purposeful. "You know, they should make these seats for actual human bodies," she whispered, glancing toward Richards with a sly smile. "Seriously, who designs this stuff? I'm practically sitting on your lap." Jake couldn't help but laugh quietly. "It's a shared space," he said, trying to keep the mood light, but there was a hint of tension in his voice that Sophie noticed. "Yeah, we're all in this together, right?" she replied, her eyes twinkling with the defiance she was so good at projecting. It was a small moment, but it made all the difference. Sophie wasn't going to let Richards win, and neither was Jake. But just as they were starting to settle back into their rhythm, Richards cleared his throat, his voice now clipped and sharp. "Could you two keep it down? Some of us are trying to work," he muttered, his gaze now fixed firmly on Jake. Jake felt his muscles tense, but Sophie was quick to respond. "Yeah, sure," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "We wouldn't want to disturb your very important work." The words hung in the air, charged with the weight of everything Richards had been trying to impose on them. But for the first time since the flight started, Jake felt a surge of something. Maybe it was defiance, or maybe it was just the exhaustion of constantly trying to shrink himself to fit the spaces other people made for him. But whatever it was, it gave him the courage to stand tall, to take up space. Richards didn't say anything more, his eyes narrowing as Sophie leaned back in her seat, her body language relaxed but clearly proud of her little jab. Jake caught her eye and offered a smile, a quiet acknowledgement that, for the first time, he wasn't just sitting back and enduring, he was standing up for himself, in small ways, but it mattered. As the flight wore on, the tension between them remained, but it wasn't as suffocating as it had been. Jake focused on his research, his thoughts drifting back to the decathlon. This was what mattered. Not the man beside him, not the stares or the judgment, but the opportunity ahead. He had a future to build, and no amount of small-minded prejudice was going to stop him from getting there. By the time the plane reached cruising altitude, Jake was more than ready to put the whole situation behind him. The tension between him and Richards was unbearable, and it felt like every minute that passed was another moment wasted. But despite the strain, Jake tried his best to stay focused. The National Science Decathlon was only a day away, and he had worked tirelessly to perfect his presentation. That at least was something he could control. Sophie, however, wasn't letting the situation slide. Every so often she would throw Jake a quick look, her eyes filled with sympathy but also determination. She had noticed the quiet hostility between him and Richards, and even though she wasn't sure how to fix it, she wasn't going to let Jake carry the weight of it alone. She had made it clear enough, she was on his side. But the plane ride wasn't over, and as the minutes dragged on, so did the discomfort of sitting so close to someone who was actively making it harder for Jake to ignore the judgment that hung in the air. Richards had barely spoken a word since their last interaction, but his cold, calculating gaze hadn't left Jake. It was almost like Richards was daring him to make a wrong move. That's when it happened. Jake had his headphones in, his mind focusing on the calculations for his presentation, but suddenly the cabin went still. He heard a noise, a sudden shift in the air that caught his attention. Sophie had shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes flickering toward the aisle. Jake followed her gaze, and there, standing a few rows away, was the flight attendant, Amara. She had a look on her face, something serious, something more than just professional. "Everything all right in row 16? Amara asked, her voice polite, but her eyes sharp. Jake's pulse quickened, and for a moment he wondered if anyone had noticed. It was the same feeling he'd always gotten when he knew someone else was watching. You could tell a lot about a person when they thought no one was paying attention, and Richards, though he was pretending to ignore the exchange between him and Sophie, had made no secret of his distaste for Jake's presence. The atmosphere in that row had been electric with tension for too long, but the flight attendant wasn't blind. She had noticed. Amara's professional smile remained intact, but her eyes narrowed slightly as she addressed Richards. Jake could almost hear the words, unspoken yet clear. This was her territory now, and she wasn't about to let anyone push things too far. For the first time, Jake felt a small flicker of hope. Maybe someone was going to intervene after all. Richards, realizing the moment had shifted, waved his hand dismissively. "It's fine," he muttered, trying to brush off the attention. "Nothing to worry about." But the woman wasn't having it. "Sir," Amara replied coolly, "I think you've said enough. Is there something you'd like to discuss with me after the flight? Or are we going to let everyone have a peaceful journey?" Sophie shot Jake a quick, supportive glance, and he couldn't help but feel the weight lifting off his chest just a little. Here was a woman who wasn't afraid to call out the behavior that others so often ignored. She wasn't going to let this man continue his little campaign of silent harassment. But even though Richards had been put in his place for the moment, Jake knew that the real confrontation was yet to come. The uncomfortable silence between them was thick, and it was clear that Richards wasn't about to let things go so easily. But the power dynamic had shifted, at least for the time being. There was a strange feeling in the air, like a storm waiting to break, and Jake wasn't sure what would happen next, but he felt more prepared to face it than he had before. As the flight continued, things seemed to settle down. Sophie was still occasionally sending him quick glances, but the constant tension between Jake and Richards had momentarily dissipated. The cabin crew continued with their duties, and Jake managed to lose himself in his presentation one more time. But Richards wasn't finished yet. Half an hour passed, and just as Jake was reviewing his notes for the upcoming competition, Richards broke the silence again, this time with a deliberate question. "So, what brings you to Los Angeles?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock curiosity. "Going to visit family?" Jake stiffened, the familiar, unwanted pressure mounting again. "No, I'm here for the National Science Decathlon," Jake said, forcing himself to answer calmly, even though every fiber of his being wanted to tell Richards to mind his own business. Richards leaned forward slightly, as though pretending to be impressed. "Science competition, huh?" he muttered. "Impressive. Must be some special program to get a kid like you into that." Jake felt his heart rate spike, his hands tightening around the armrest. The words were a veiled jab, a suggestion that Jake's success couldn't possibly be earned. It had to be due to some sort of special treatment. The subtle racism was unmistakable, but Jake refused to react. Not this time. Sophie, ever the fighter, interjected before Jake could answer. "Actually," she said, her voice light but laced with a sharpness that Richards couldn't ignore, "he's one of only 12 finalists in the entire country. His project is on gravitational waves from binary black hole mergers, not exactly your average science fair project." The emphasis on "not your average" was a quiet burn, and Jake felt a sudden swell of pride for Sophie's defense. He wasn't some token or exception. He had earned this spot, and Richard's attempts to belittle him were nothing more than a weak attempt to restore some sense of control. Richards, clearly uncomfortable, shifted in his seat and muttered something about how back in my day we had to earn everything, none of these diversity programs. Sophie smiled sweetly, but it was a smile full of venom. "Yeah, those diversity programs really seem to be the problem, don't they?" she quipped, her tone dripping with sarcasm. The tension was nearly unbearable now. Everyone else around them was pretending not to notice, but Jake could feel the weight of their gaze. Some passengers shifted in their seats, some looking away, others craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the drama unfolding. Jake didn't care about them, but it was hard to ignore the ripple effect Richard's words were creating. Jake couldn't help but respond this time. "Maybe it's not about diversity programs. Maybe it's about giving everyone a fair shot," he said, his voice low but steady. "And if that bothers you, that's your problem." For a moment, Richards just stared at him, the anger in his eyes palpable. He opened his mouth to say something else, but Sophie beat him to it, her voice sharp and direct. You're just mad because your merit system only works when the odds are stacked in your favor. Isn't that right?" Richards clenched his jaw, his face turning red. But before he could say another word, the flight attendants arrived, bringing the tension to an abrupt end. The conversation stopped, and Jake allowed himself a small, satisfied breath. As the plane began its descent toward Los Angeles, Jake looked out the window, feeling the weight of the flight lifting from his shoulders. He had done it. He had stood his ground, and Sophie had been there every step of the way. Maybe the real journey had just begun, but for now, Jake knew that he was ready. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same courage and dignity that had carried him through this flight. As the plane touched down in Los Angeles, Jake could feel the tension that had gripped him throughout the flight begin to melt away. He had made it. Despite the harassment, despite the discomfort, he was still here, standing tall and proud, ready for the National Science Decathlon. His journey wasn't just about the competition, though. It had become a personal victory. Jake had faced adversity and handled it with grace and strength, refusing to let the actions of others define him. And Sophie? She had been the ally he never expected, the one person who saw his struggle and stood by him, showing that support can come from the most unexpected places. As Jake stepped off the plane, he realized that this was just the beginning. The world would throw its challenges at him, and not everyone would see him for who he truly was. But what mattered most was how he responded. He had learned that courage comes in small moments. The decision to stand your ground when others try to push you down, the strength to hold your head high when faced with judgment, and the power to support others who are fighting their own battles. The lesson was clear. Don't let anyone diminish your worth. Stand up for yourself, and never back down from what you believe in. And most importantly, remember that we're stronger together. In a world that often feels divided, moments of solidarity and support can make all the difference. If you enjoyed this story, hit the comment button and type 1 to let me know. If you haven't yet liked the video, comment 0, and I'll work on making the content even better for you. Let's keep these conversations going. Together we can all rise above the challenges we face.